All right, so in this video, we will begin talking about biomolecules. There are four main types of biomolecules that we'll be discussing, and we'll talk about their functional roles and what types of roles they carry out in the body. So to start out, biomolecules are really the molecules of life. And when I say that, I mean that these biomolecules are largely what make up our body's composition. And they're also, three of these are what comprise our diet, right? We're talking about carbs, fat, and protein. So those are frequent sources of energy intake for us, and hence drive our cellular functions and drive our life processes. So continuing on with that point, so food contains biomolecules. And I'll put some sub-bullets here. So we not only consume them from other sources, but we consume that food to get two main things. So there's two things that, our bodies are getting in return for consuming them. And the first is energy, right? Might be pretty intuitive. So you come home after school, you are kind of exhausted. Maybe the first thing you do is go to the fridge and get a snack because you know that you need some energy before you start doing your homework. So we use food as an energy source. If you stopped eating food, say you skipped 3 meals in a row, I think you would start to notice relatively quickly that you'd be pretty drained of energy. But the second thing that we don't really think much about is eating food for a source of atoms. So we know that from our discussion on the first law of thermodynamics that, atoms and matter are not created or destroyed. So in our body, we're not just, spontaneously creating atoms. We need to get those building blocks from external sources, and that's the food we eat. However, though, when I say consume atoms, these biomolecules are much larger than atoms. So when we're talking about these large carb and lipid and protein structures, especially, we're talking about tons of molecules, even millions of them bonded together. So biomolecules are large, and because they're large, they're often called macromolecules. So macro, conversely to micro usually means something's very small. The prefix macro usually means that something's very large, and biomolecules are large. Macromolecules are defined as molecules that are built from smaller repeating units. Everything is bold today. So I'd like to elaborate on this a little bit. So it's built from smaller repeating units. In a way, this is analogous to, say, a Lego structure. Thinking of like a really popular Lego structure to build, maybe it's the Hogwarts castle from Harry Potter. In that case, so if we're talking about this in an analogy sense, the macromolecule would be the Hogwarts castle. The smaller repeating units would be each Lego that you are using to build that larger object. That's really how the biology of these biomolecules is laid out. You have these small repeating units, such as the Legos, that are continuously linked together, stacked together to create larger structures like the macromolecules. So just to hit that point home here, this point will say chain links make up a long chain. And there's four main groups of biomolecules that we are going to be talking about today. The first is carbohydrates. But first, I want to add a couple kind of synonyms up to the top of these column headers. So the biomolecule type, right, when we're talking about the biomolecule or the macromolecule, we're talking about the whole chain. And they are made of repeating units, which will be the chain links. So those will be like the Lego pieces. General function in cells. So sometimes in the body we have to make biomolecules, but we're going to talk about in this column what these biomolecule types are really like what process they're conducting in our body. And what does our body do to them when we eat them? That'll be our fourth column. So we start out with carbs. So you notice this first one right off the bat is a large component of our diet, right? You need to consume a certain ratio of carbs to fat to protein in order to carry out your everyday life and function. Certain diet types will tell you to restrict the amount of carb intake. I'm thinking something like, what is it, the keto diet or the Atkins diet tells you to not consume carbs, but rather consume more protein. The truth is, and I always like to give this little disclaimer when talking about these macromolecules, is about the diet industry in general. So you'll be walking in the grocery store, see a magazine that tells you about this new fad diet that tells you to completely cut out probably one of these groups. It'll say, oh, don't eat carbs, oh, don't eat fat. But a lot of that is pretty blatant misinformation, and it's pretty important that you're consuming a certain ratio of all of these groups in order to have a balanced diet. So we're going to talk about some of the functions and why that might make more sense on why you need each of these. So the reason we consume carbs, they're the main energy source. So carbs are actually your body's preferred first energy source. However, it's not generally long-term energy. It's usually shorter bursts of energy. Almost think about it like a small battery. There's some juice, but it's not enough to keep you running for that long. There's also another function that's not really related to energy expenditure, but carbs can also label and identify cells from other species cells. And we will talk a little bit more about that later. So I want to make a quick differentiation here. I know we've talked about these being the energy source, and it's a short-term energy source, but that can range within carbs as well. So say, for instance, you come home from school and you eat an apple. That is generally a pretty short-term, like maybe 20 to 30 minutes worth of energy, because those are considered simple carbohydrates in that apple, those chemical bonds in there that you're breaking as you digest it. However, on the other hand, if you have, let's say, a soccer game on Saturday and it's Friday night and you want to begin sometimes what they call carbo loading, you might eat a plate of pasta. That pasta and the chemical bonds in those pasta noodles probably have complex carbohydrate structures. And as your body is trying to digest complex carbs versus, the simple carbs, those can actually act as a longer term energy source. So you can get up to 24 hours of energy from large amounts of complex carbs. So I just want to make that differentiation. So what does our body do to carbs when we eat them? So the first used for energy, and secondarily used for atoms. So like we said, atoms aren't just going to spontaneously appear in your body. You need to consume them from an external source. So you can use the atoms in the carbohydrate molecules to build other things that your body needs. The other important thing here to talk about is to go back to that chain link versus whole chain idea. So mono as a prefix means one. So if we go under here and we say one sugar, mono means one, and saccharide is, I believe, Latin for sugar. So that's what the chain link is. So the Lego piece in this scenario is a monosaccharide molecule. So one sugar. And then when we get to kind of the large structure, so say this is the castle that we're trying to build with our Legos, we call that larger carb structure a polysaccharide. We already know saccharide means sugar, but poly usually means many. So if you think of like, say, I don't know, polygamy versus monogamy, it's the same idea, right? Mono means one, poly means several. And so it's pretty clear when you look at these prefixes that this one is one chain link, and then many of those chain links make up the larger structure. All right, so moving on from carbs, we move on to fats. And really this category should be called fats and oils because they both fall under the lipid category. And fats and oils, what are we really referring to? So this could be both saturated and unsaturated fats. So say you have a stick of butter, that might be saturated fat. That counts under this lipid category, but you can also have things like oils, like olive oil, even though it's maybe unsaturated, it still falls under this lipid category. Those are so the lipid is the castle, it's the large macromolecule. What is the repeating link? It is fatty acids. So fatty acids combine together to create lipid structures. Fats are also used as an energy source, but unlike carbs, they're mostly regarded as a long-term energy source. So I'll put that as their function here. Long-term energy source, right? This is awful to think, but if you were, say, starving, you would probably fare better if you had, say, a thicker layer of fat on your skeleton, right? Because you would have those energy stores to pull from for survival. The other main function of fats is in our cell membranes, and this might be a little challenging to think about, but each of your cells have a membrane. The membrane's function is to allow certain things to come in and allow certain things to keep out. But that membrane is made of lipids, so it's actually made of a type of fat, and it's really important because it serves as that barrier, right? It's like a semi-permeable barrier. Like I said, it allows things that we need to come in and things that we need to stay out. So it's kind of a protective barrier for our cells. And then this actually has the same, like, what does our body do to them when we eat them? It's the same function as carbs. So first used for energy, second for atoms. And we'll elaborate more on each of these later if you have questions about them. Next one is protein, and protein is a little different than carbs and fat in the sense that it's not used primarily as an energy source. So once again, following the same trend, protein is the macromolecule, so it's the large structure. What are the small Lego pieces that are building up to make the protein? Those would be the amino acids. The function of proteins is to be cellular machines. So each different type of protein has a specific function based on its shape that it carries out in the body. So really the function of these are to each have their own, each machine has its job that it's carrying out. We have several different types of proteins that your body is synthesizing, so they each have jobs that they need to carry out in the cells. And here, like what our body does when we eat them, it's actually the opposite. It is proteins are first used for atoms to build other structures. We're really using proteins as materials for building block source material. And second, used for energy. So there's definitely less emphasis on either a short-term or long-term energy source. And when we say that we're sort of using atoms as, we're using these proteins as like building source material. How many of you may maybe go to the gym often and afterwards you drink a protein shake? Well, why are you really drinking that protein shake? Why wouldn't you drink it before the workout? So in this scenario, right, it's probably you have something like pre-workout, maybe it has carbohydrates, maybe it's got caffeine in it, some type of energy source to get you kind of geared up for the workout. Afterwards, though, you've maybe created tears in your muscles, you are sore, you need to recover. That's when you would start drinking the protein shake, right? Because those proteins have cellular machinery jobs and the atom sources that you need to rebuild those muscles. So proteins are, a lot of their function is actually used in damage control too, and rebuilding parts of your body. And the last macromolecule group is nucleic acids. So most commonly, this is DNA and RNA. So deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. So you've probably definitely heard of this, especially say, for instance, you've gotten the COVID vaccine. So that has a messenger RNA component to it, right? That's a nucleic acid. DNA is sort of the blueprint for everything that your cell makes. So we'll actually add that as the function here. So what is encoding you? What is encoding your genes? What is mapping out characteristics of you as a starting point, right? Obviously, environment plays a role in how you look and maybe certain ailments that you'll become vulnerable to, but DNA and your genetic code really set the foundation for that. So the large structure, DNA, is made up of nucleotides as its smaller subunit. And those are the instructions for everything that a cell can make. And this actually has the same kind of hierarchy to what our bodies use it for. So we first use it for atoms, and it can also be used for energy, but in a much more minute sense than fats and carbs. So now there's actually an independent activity that I would like you to attempt. And here, say, for instance, we're starting out with the carbohydrates, right? If you remember, the smaller Lego type structure is the monosaccharides. That means one sugar. We've got 4 monosaccharide structures here. And what this assignment is really meant to do is to help you perceive patterns across these biomolecules. So you're going to identify the common atoms in every example. So you can just give the element, right, the atomic symbol here. Next is to identify common structures or shapes of the molecules. So, are you noticing these ring-like structures? Are you noticing lots of branching? Anything that you note can go in this box here. If it would be helpful for you, Microsoft Word does allow you to use shapes, and say you wanted to outline this. You could use these boxes to start drawing around certain structures if you need to. So B is to identify those common structures or shapes, and C is to find common functional groups present in every example. So remember, we covered the functional groups. They add a certain level of reactivity to the structure, right? They determine how reactive that molecule is. So just start to recognize patterns in these monosaccharides. We also move along to the fatty acids or the lipid category. We've got 5 examples here. And you're basically going to carry out those same 3 steps. Try to identify patterns in the atoms, structures, and functional groups. So do that here for number 2. We've also got 4 different amino acid structures that you're going to try to identify patterns across, and then 3 types of nucleotides. And you'll see that these structures start to look pretty complex. So you'll probably have a lot more to write for the functional groups, for nucleotides in particular. And I think this is a good place to stop here. So give this activity a shot, and we will discuss the answers later on.